Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. I hope that you're having a good week and that you are pursuing the Lord in all that you're doing, that you're making Him known, and that you are placing your trust in Him as you walk through everything about your week. So, as we continue walking through 1 Corinthians, we're in chapter 7. This past week at our church, I preached out of chapter 11. So, stay with me. We're going to revisit 11 when we get there. I promise we'll go very in depth at that point, talk about the Lord's Supper, but we're continuing in chapter 7, talking about issues of marriage and about different relationships and things like that. Today, we're talking about singleness. And as we mentioned 2 weeks ago, this chapter is a very sensitive chapter, right? Discussions of marriage. And next week, we're going to be talking about marriage. We're going to talk about divorce. We're going to talk about a lot of sensitive issues. I promise that I'm going to stay as close to the text as humanly possible. But this week, I want to talk about singleness. This passage is we're going to be 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I have my text pulled up over here. And I'll be marking it as we usually do. But this section is usually treated with what follows, with this theme of remain as you are. I wanted to pay some special attention to singleness because it's often an area that's neglected in our churches. And so we'll just make a brief word about it. So this lesson might not be as long as normal because we're literally doing 2 verses, but I promise there's a lot going on in these verses. So let's look here, verses 8 and 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain as I am. But if they do not have self-control, they should marry, since it is better to marry than to burn with desire. So I want to address singleness, and I want to address I apologize, I don't even like that term, life stage, but that position in life. So let's look at the text first. I say, so it's Paul, and I think this is very significant to remember that the author is Paul. Paul is a single disciple, right? As far as we know, Peter is the only one that we know was married. Apart from that, all the others appear that they could be singles, and Paul is certainly no different. Paul is single. I say and he's speaking to 2 kinds of people specifically, the unmarried and to widows. Now, could he certainly be speaking to widowers? Yes, just in all likelihood back then, a man's standing as a widower was much different than a widow's standing would be socially. It was also, men just typically didn't have as long of lifespans, so it's more likely to be widows. So to the unmarried, so this could be young unmarried people, this could be young unmarried women, this could be young unmarrieds, or just unmarrieds in general, because as we see, it's unmarried. Or to the widows, so those who were married and then their spouses passed away. Paul says it is good. So it's good. What Paul's about to say is a positive thing. It is good for them, the unmarried and the widows, if they remain as I am. Which in this discussion, Paul is single. And we actually get that. I'm going to flip up here to verse 7. We read this a little bit ago. I wish that all people were as I am, but to each his own gift from God. Each person has this gift, another has that, right? So Paul is single, and he's saying it is good if you remain as I am, right? Remain as I am. But, Paul says, but if, so notice here we have if, right? So 2 if statements. If they do not have self-control, which remember in Corinth, the key issue is sexual immorality and sexual deviancy. So it's very likely he's referring to the fact that some don't have self-control in Corinth. If they don't have self-control, they should marry, since it is better to marry than to burn with desire. Now, in discussing singleness, a couple of things to note. One is Paul does not have a negative view of marriage in and of itself. Actually, over in Ephesians, we find that Paul uses marriage as one of the most important doctrinal statements about the church. We are the bride of Christ, right? So Paul, he has a positive view. A lot of his descriptions of gender and of various things like that are based in a positive view of marriage rooted in the garden. So when God created man, he created man in his own image, and then he deemed it not good for this man to be alone. So he created woman, right? So man and woman were both created equal in value, though distinctly different in role and function. We're equal in value, but we function differently. And that's a good thing. God made us that way in the garden. Paul here says if they don't have self-control, so apparently it's something to do with sexual immorality, then they should marry. Why is he saying they should marry? Earlier he said it'd be good if you'd stay like I am, single. However, if you don't have self-control, go get married, since it is better to marry than to burn with desire. So Paul is not saying, if you look at the total corpus of Paul's teachings, he is not saying that marriage is a bad thing. Actually, he would more often not say marriage is a good thing. What Paul is dealing with here, my opinion, is the key aspect is this self-control and if. I think those are the key words in understanding what's going on here, right? As well as this idea of remain. What Paul is dealing with is our focus, right? Obviously, Paul is an extremely driven and focused man. All he sees is Christ. That's it. And so he says, if you're unmarried, you should remain as I am. And I think Paul is saying, look, I'm single and serve the Lord. You should remain as I am. To not make marriage an idol. If you are content in your singleness, right? And not content is a tricky word. We typically use content with this idea of satisfaction, right? Does being single satisfy me? The better question is Christ the only thing that satisfies you? If yes, remain as I am. It's a glorious thing. According to Paul, it is a glorious thing if you are able to remain as I am. If you're able to be single and serve the Lord, and that's your total focus, that is a beautiful thing. Continue on in that. I want to encourage you with that. Perhaps you're a single person who's listening to this. Maybe you're a widow. Maybe you're in this unmarried, and it's an indescript. There's been a divorce. There's been whatever. Remain as I am. I love this picture Paul is painting. We oftentimes glorify marriage. Maybe you've heard the statement that man is not complete unless he's married. Number one, you don't find that in Scripture. That's a misinterpretation of Genesis. And two, we are all created in God's image. Single Paul was no less in God's image than I am as a married man. So remain as you are. If you are satisfied in serving the Lord as a single, serve the Lord. Serve the Lord. However, if you don't have self-control, you should marry, because it's better to marry than to burn with desire. And I don't think Paul is excusing us from serving the Lord here. I think what he's saying is, for some of us, the desire to be married, the desire to have that covenant, would be so overwhelming that we would misallocate that desire, and it would place us in this world of a lack of self-control. It is better to marry and to take care of that, because perhaps your giftedness is not singleness, and that's okay. Being single does not make you better than being married. Being married does not make you better than being single. What Paul is seeking, specifically here in 8 and 9, is for us to be unhindered in our service to the Lord. So are you single? That's great. That's great. And if you don't have that burning desire, that burden in you that you just must be married and you have no issue of self-control, be satisfied in the Lord. Perhaps, though, you're one who's to be married. If you're single and wish to be married, don't make an idol out of it, but instead serve the Lord. Trust in Him and follow Him. He will walk with you in that process, and it will be frustrating, and that's normal. But in the end, our goal either way is not to be married and not to be single. Our goal is to serve the Lord. So which way must you serve the Lord? Single or married? So short verses, wanted to touch on the glorification of either singleness or being married, as well as the put down of either. Either way, Paul's saying, I want you to serve the Lord. Being single means you're not concerned with that marriage. And he in other places says you're not distracted. But if you need to be married, go get married, but in the end, serve the Lord. So that's this passage. It's a very short passage, and I know that I kind of stepped off the text a little bit and brought some other ideas in. But in the end, the goal of our singleness and our marriage is the exact same, that we would serve the Lord. So I want to encourage you, whether you're single or whether you're married, go serve the Lord. Next week, we'll go further in chapter 7. It's going to be a sensitive passage next week. So read ahead, and we're going to show grace to one another as we walk forward into some very difficult passages. Can't wait to see you next week.